having made it across the sea, they proceed, and eventually they come to a mountain. And this presumably was not just by accident. They were supposed to go back to the mountain, at least in one of the accounts earlier on, where Moses had already encountered Yahweh.
That's right.
Now, when we talked about this in connection with Exodus chapter 3, this was when Moses was in Midian, so not in what we call the Sinai Peninsula, but way across another body of water and still way to the south of Israel.
That's right.
Hardly a reasonable way for anybody to go if they knew where they were going in the long run, if you want to end up in Israel.
But to be fair, even if the Mount Sinai in the Bible were the Mount Sinai that we call Mount Sinai today in the Sinai Peninsula, it's already out of the way. But I think it's probably worth saying up front, the Mount Sinai in the Bible is almost certainly not the Mount Sinai that we call Mount Sinai today in the peninsula that we call Sinai today. As far as I understand it, that mountain was identified as Mount Sinai, I think in the 4th century AD.
And I suppose it was identified by somebody who figured that it was a little bit more, more plausible route.
Right.
And God knows you will often find in Bibles maps of the course of the Exodus that take them down there.
That's right. But I don't think that's where this was.
No. But it's this is a mountain where God was known to reveal himself. And we have this, as we said before, in other poetic passages where God comes from Sinai in the south.
That's right.
Now, the popular vision, though, I mean, what most of us associate with Mount Sinai in the context of the Exodus is the giving of the law and the making of a covenant.
That's right.
The covenant we will get in much more elaborate form in Deuteronomy. Sometimes people tend to read that back into all of Exodus. In the full form of it, as people imagine it now or reconstruct it, it's modeled on a treaty form where you have a recitation of the history that leads up to it and you have curses and blessings at the end of it. But you don't really get this here in Exodus.
No.
Now, you may get some form of a covenant, you will get some laws, but really what we start out with is a theophany.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to separate, I think, the 3 major elements you're talking about, which is theophany, that is the appearance of God, covenant, which can take many different forms, the kind in Deuteronomy and others, and law, which can also take a variety of forms. And I don't think that complex of all 3 of those is an original part of the Sinai tradition. The theophany is basic.
Okay, let's talk about the theophany first of all. What always strikes me when I read this passage is how fit Moses must have been.
By the end of it, at least.
He runs up and down the mountain.
Yeah.
You know, and the crew team at Harvard used to train by running up and down the steps of the stadium. Moses would have been fit and ready for it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, when you read the text as it stands, Moses goes up and down far more than would seem necessary.
Yeah. And why is this?
Well, surprise, surprise. The reason is here, especially here, this is one of the few places where all of the sources of Exodus converge to agree on the very basic. There was a moment of encounter between God and the people at a mountain in the wilderness.
Okay.
And so the ups and the downs are really, they go back to the fact that one source has Moses going up and down once or twice, and another one once or twice, and another one once or twice, and you add it all up, and he's got quite an exercise regimen there.
Now, the usual impression, again, just like the crossing of the sea, Yale Cecil B. DeMille has kind of dominated that episode, here the giving of the law.
Yeah.
Now, was that in all of them? Was this original to it? What do you think?
No.
Big debate actually 50 years ago because some German scholars said, you have a history of salvation of the Exodus on the one hand, and then the giving of the law is something else. Now, was there any basis for that?
Yeah. There is. Part of the issue is not every one of the stories about this encounter at the mountain has law-giving at all. In fact, the Yahwist, the J story, has no law whatsoever.
You see, I think this would be a real revelation. The real revelation of the Sinai story to a lot of people nowadays.
I think that's probably true.
Would be, that you can tell that story and have no giving of the law.
No giving of the law. In fact, the J story is really pure theophany. Right? The purpose of the stop at the mountain is for God to visibly come down so that the people can see, maybe not God directly, but this fiery descent of the deity.
Yeah.
They're all supposed to see that. It's a matter of proving to the people that God is really there traveling with them.
And, we might mention in passing that there was a kind of show that was associated with the Theophany.
Yeah.
And, it probably arises from thunderstorms and the like, but usually it's a big dark cloud and fire.
That's right.
That puts, so to speak, the fear of God into people.
That's right.
Yeah.
So J is pure theophany. It's just proof of God's presence.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
So that after Moses has been telling them all along that I met this God on this mountain, and now that he's got them through various adventures,
That's right.
And here he is.
That's right. I mean, if you think about, it's in the J story that we get all of the people's doubts, right? Back to when God first calls to Moses, and Moses says, "What if they don't believe me?" Well, you do some signs and wonders. And what if they don't believe me then, and they actually don't a little bit? It's in the J story that in the space between departure from Egypt and Sinai, where the people are hungry for food and water, and they ask out loud, is God in our midst or not? And I think that's the driving impetus behind the revelation here. The answer is yes.
In the priestly source, what's the point of going to Mount Sinai?
In the priestly story, which is, in terms of revelation, far briefer, but in terms of what happens thereafter, far more extensive.
I mean, it's really quite brief, I think.
It's quite brief, right? They come, God, again, descends in a cloud. We talk about it, the glory of God, or the presence of God is what the people see, not God directly, God forbid. And what happens on the mountain when Moses goes up is neither covenant nor law. It is, somewhat strangely, the giving of an architectural blueprint.
Yeah.
What God gives Moses on the mountain, and the only thing that is delivered to Moses actually on top of the mountain, is the design for the tabernacle, which is going to be God's new home.
Yeah.
God has dwelt in the heavens, or maybe on the mountain, somewhere else, and from this moment forward, God is going to live among the Israelites, and here's how you're going to build his house. And all of the laws in the priestly source are given from inside the tabernacle, that is, down on the ground, on the foot of the mountain. The mountain exists only for the giving of the blueprint.
Yeah, and that, of course, is what most concerned the priests.
Of course.
So that's what they get.
That's
so
right.
Where did we get this idea that there was a law given on Mount Sinai?
The bulk of what we think of classically, traditionally, as the story of Sinai comes from the E source, who ironically don't think the mountain is called Sinai at all. They think it's called Horeb. But it's from the E source that we get the notion of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, the giving of law, the making of covenant. That's the E story, really. I think that one of the key differentiators, when we come across Exodus 19, for people who are looking for a clue as to how we distinguish the J and the E stories for instance, is the question of how the people relate to the mountain. Right? In some passages, God is going to appear on the mountain, and he's afraid that the people are going to run up the mountain and are going to try and come close and touch him. And so he says repeatedly, no one can come up the mountain. And then a couple of verses later, the people seem to be terrified of going anywhere near the mountain, and Moses has to drag them to it. And that, I think, is a serious conflict. What's going on in the E story, if J is God is going to appear and the people are going to see him and that's how they're going to know he's there, in E, God says, I am going to come down in a cloud and I will speak with you. I'm going to talk to you, Moses. And the people are going to hear us talking and so believe you as a prophet forever.
So do the people ever actually hear the words of God?
I think they do. I think this is exactly what happens. And the words that they hear God speak are the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, okay. Now, but then, in fact, the story goes on, or at least the speech attributed to God goes on. Do they have to take Moses' word for that?
So
or Aaron's, as the case may be.
They agree to this, right? The whole point of the auditory revelation is that the people will hear the Ten Commandments, which they do, at which point they say to Moses, we don't want to hear anymore. This is terrifying and scary. We've heard God talk to you, and we trust you. We trust that when you come to us and talk and say God said something, we're going to believe you from now on.
But actually then you could draw the inference from this, that what you're going to get, and at least once you get past the Ten Commandments, are not directly the words of God, but the reformulated words of God. The words as Moses narrates them.
This is true. This is true. That is, the law proper, the laws of Exodus 21 to 23, all of the laws of Leviticus, all of the laws of Deuteronomy, the people in the story, the Israelites, only hear them mediated through Moses.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting point that in the Bible as a whole, almost no one is capable of repeating something verbatim. Right? Yeah. This is something that happens in the Bible. It goes all the way back to Genesis 1 or Genesis 2 and 3, right, where the snake asks Eve, "So what did God say about the fruit?" And she sort of repeats what God said, but it's not. It's not quite what he said. And so that inability of people to actually accurately reproduce what they hear is an interesting point, I think, in relationship to the
and of course then you get a whole new shot at it in Deuteronomy.
Right.
Again later on. Now, what you're going to get here then are laws, and much has been made of the fact that you have really two quite different kinds of laws. You have what we call the apodictic laws and the Ten Commandments.
Right. You shall not.
Yes. And then you will have the more conditional laws that we'll come back to talk about in the Book of the Covenant.
That's right.
Now, people used to think that these apodictic laws were peculiarly Israelite.
Right.
This doesn't seem to be the case.
No.
A couple of things, we probably won't have time here to get into the Ten Commandments in great detail, but do they presuppose monotheism?
Hardly.
Do they start out, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall not have other gods besides me."
Right.
But are there other gods that you might have had besides me?
Right. You would think that if there were no other gods at all to be even considered, you wouldn't have to say, "Don't follow other gods."
Yeah.
Monotheism is a far later invention, a far later arrival into Israelite thought than I think most people are aware of or familiar with.
And I think there would be some disagreement as to when you can speak of it. Some people would speak of it at the time of the Babylonian exile. But some of us would even push it much later than that. That the real issue here is not what gods you believe exist, but what gods you actually worship.
Right.
And that, I think, is where you have a good analogy with the treaties, because what the Assyrian kings, for example, were demanding is not that you don't know there are other kings out there, but this is the one you got to obey.
In fact, and this is how it ties in nicely to the history, right? It is God says to the Israelites, right, "You shall have no other gods beside me." And he's got a reason for that, right? He can look back and say, right, he doesn't just say you have no other gods before. He says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt," right? I did something for you in the past. It's not there are no other gods. It's you are uniquely obligated to me because I'm the one who saved you back there. I'm the one who did these remarkable things. You're mine.
Yeah. One other point that I would bring up here about the Ten Commandments. One of the best known of the Ten Commandments is translated popularly as "Thou shalt not kill." And then you read on in the next chapter and you find the penalty for just about everything is kill him.
Yep.
So how should we translate it? "Thou shalt not murder."
Murder is better. Murder is certainly better.
And murder, after all, is what? Killing that isn't permitted.
Right. Right. It's a question of definition. There's a fine semantic line, and it might shift, but you're right. Non-permitted, non-condoned killing, I think, is what's at stake here.
Yeah, so the popular slogan that people put up from time to time, which part of thou shalt not do you not understand?
Right. The answer
that
is...
That much may be clear enough.
The answer
but when
is
you actually
kill.
get to the kill...
That's the one.
Yeah.